Regardless of when the 15th general election is held, the finance minister has already tabled the 2023 budget yesterday. Meant to safeguard the people's well-being, the supply bill is also to make sure businesses remain resilient to global headwinds. Now, are the support measures announced yesterday expected or otherwise? I'm Azaria Tagaya, and this is Money Matters. Good evening and welcome to Money Matters. Now, the 2023 budget was tabled 24 hours ago. What's interesting in the national spending plan? Well, we're now going to our newsroom to speak with our assistant business editor, Muhammad Faiz Aizat Azali. Now, Faiz, can you tell us more about the 2023 budget?
Yes, Azaria, it was indeed at a unique time and juncture that the 2023 budget was tabled yesterday, especially with the hype of the 15th general election, and there's also a lot of external headwinds. The possible recession in the US, European zone, China's slowdown will definitely impact the Malaysian economy next year. Looking at the budget speech by the finance minister, it appeared to be forward-looking and reactive. It's all about managing the COVID-19 crisis and the economic recovery, and the way for the government to strengthen the economic core foundation heading to a much more challenging 2023. The government is aware that there's a dire need for the economy to have a more stable footing next year. And for that, we see that the 2023 budget highlights these key areas. While the 2022 budget was coined as the biggest one, now we see that more is being pumped in, and for 2023, this appears to be the biggest budget. For the 2022, the economy is expected to expand between 6.5 to 7%. That's with a favorable growth momentum in the domestic economy and steady expansion in the external sector. And as for next year, we are looking at a figure of between 4 and 5%. And that's provided that the fundamentals are strong and the economic structure is diverse, coupled with ongoing policy support to cushion the impact of rising cost of living. As for the government revenue, it's expected to fall 4.4% next year at 272.5 billion ringgit. Operating expenditure also down 4.3%, while development expenditure jumping to 32.4% to 94.3 billion ringgit. Fiscal deficit 5.5% for 2023 compared with the expected 5.8% this year. In a nutshell, Azaria, we see that the 2023 budget is set to adopt measures to further strengthen the momentum of recovery, build economic resilience and catalyze comprehensive reforms.
Thank you, Faiz, from our newsroom. Well, now for more on that, we have in the studio now with us Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams. He is a non-resident senior fellow of the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research, MIER. Welcome to the program, Professor. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. It's nice to be here.
Well, Professor, to start things off, this is, of course, the highest allocation ever for a national budget. Of course, last year was the highest, but this year is even higher. The finance minister said that this budget is for the people, for businesses and also for the economy. If I'm not mistaken, Professor, you've said before that the government actually needs to maintain a small budget, but apparently this isn't what we saw yesterday. So what's your take on that? Is the highest allocation ever for the budget, is it really conducive for us?
There is a view that if you have a bigger budget, it's better government. And actually, that doesn't really follow. It's not true to say that. My view was that the budget last year was at record levels because of specific reasons to do with COVID, coming out of COVID and responding to the health issues around COVID.
Yeah.
And that because they were special measures and because those are easing off quite rapidly, that there was room for that saving to be taken out of the budget. Now, instead, what we've seen is a really quite surprising increase in the total amount, a 12% increase in spending. everybody in Malaysia would have had about 1,300 ringgit a year, or 100 ringgit a month, about 100 ringgit a month. And if it had been reallocated back to the B40, you could have had 270 ringgit a month for every member of the B40. And instead, what the government has done is taken this 40 billion and spent it on its own list of projects, rather than redistributing back into the people. And so if this is a budget for the people really didn't get very much.
How will this, the budget that was tabled yesterday, how will it affect the market, the ringgit, and also interest rates?
Well, just a few weeks ago, I was watching a similar budget, a mini budget in the United Kingdom with our finance minister. And as he was speaking, the pound was collapsing. So I was watching Tengku Zafrul doing his speech, and I was looking at the ringgit. Nothing happened. And what that tells you is that nobody cares, actually, about the budget, because they were neither buying nor selling the ringgit. It's not that they weren't watching it, they were watching it, but they obviously don't feel that the budget is going to have much of an effect. Perhaps they don't feel that it's a budget that will be implemented. For example, if there is an election to come up, we don't know whether this budget will be changed in the future. We don't know what the government will think in terms of its spending when we have a new government after the election. So the markets didn't really react. In terms of the interest rate and the debt markets, the overall level of debt hasn't changed that much in terms of the absolute amount. As a percentage of GDP, it will fall because GDP will rise. But the government is still borrowing about as much money, it's about 95 billion, something like that, and it's still paying as much to finance that. And so that hasn't changed very much at all. Now, that's a problem as far as I can see, because it did have the possibility of reducing the debt, and that would have reduced the debt payment costs. And the debt payment costs are one of the biggest elements of the budget's spending, government spending. And instead of spending that money on infrastructure or on welfare or on education or on health, government continues to spend that money paying the financing costs for the debt. So it could have used the increased revenue to pay down some of the debt, release some of that cost to put back into the three pillars that it said, the people, businesses and the economy. And it didn't.
Another thing that I want to get your views on, Professor, is we see that in this proposed budget, the resident individual income tax rate is being reduced by 2 percentage points. Now, will this have an impact on the government's coffers?
It will and it won't, in the sense that actually when you lower taxes, it has an incentive effect, and that incentive effect encourages economic growth. And so the revenue that you get often increases when you reduce taxes. We call this supply-side economics. And certainly all around the world there is evidence that when you lower the tax rates, the revenue rises. So in that respect, you wouldn't necessarily see that there would be a big impact. But there is one thing which is quite strange about the Malaysian budget, which is that the total amount of money that the government is getting in revenues as a percentage of GDP has been falling consistently over time. If you went back to 2009, it would have been above 20%. Now it's around 14 or 15%. So because the government hasn't really changed the tax system, and there was no evidence, particularly of tax reform, no discussion of GST, for example, the diversity of revenue sources and the total amount of revenue as a percentage of GDP is actually falling. So the government's missing out on that type of structural reform.
Indeed. Now, Professor, of course, we want to get more views from you after this, but we'll be speaking with the Malaysian International Chamber of Commerce and Industry, MICCI, virtually. Its Executive Director, Shaun Cheah, is already on standby. That is in just a moment as we head for a quick commercial break. So stay tuned.
I would say finally I got something from the budget. Finally, after all these past years of the budget that we have. It's good for this round, I would say.
That's good, at least the 2% reduction will give more back to us. I think yes, I would say okay, because income tax reduce, it's good for us getting more back income, net income. In terms of going back to the government, I think it might help, it might not help, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I think that this is a good move because M50 it's a group that has been left out in the previous or the budgets or previous orders, like assistance package given by the governments.
Thanks for staying with us on Money Matters. We're still with our guest in studio, Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams, and we're also joined virtually now by the Executive Director of the Malaysian International Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Shaun Edward Cheah. Shaun, welcome to Money Matters.
Hi, thank you for the invite.
Thank you. It's our pleasure to have you today. Now, let's go straight into it. The budget, the largest allocation ever in the country's history. Are you happy, basically, with what was tabled yesterday?
Well, it's an expected election budget, but what we want, what we hear is good, is that there's a recognition that the economic activities is going to be leading us to post-pandemic recovery, and is also about economic resilience. So those are the good messages that we are hearing from yesterday's budget.
I see. Now, do you see that the budget that was tabled yesterday, do you see it being conducive to the business sector overall?
Yes, that's where we felt that the recognition of the economic activities is leading the budget. Therefore, there were a lot of, other than the goodies of this for the civil servants and the social safety nets, tax cuts, we see that there is a lot of push towards the industry to promote the activity. A lot of the domestic, more domestic type incentives, such as the financing, the equity crowdfunding, tourism, incentives for the E&E sectors, EV, especially agro, and some e-commerce technology. And it's good that they wrap around it with the ESG, SDG policies to encourage the industry to grow. And there is also another point that there was this push towards jobs, the creation of jobs. And of course, with jobs, there's also looking at human talents, and you can see a lot of policies in developing the human talents to feed into the jobs, okay? Like reskilling and education, addressing women, OKU, ex-prisoners to get back into the workforce and less reliance on the foreign labor. Then there's also sufficient protection of the P-hailing, the gig economy workers and stuff like that. So it's good. It's trying to create a business environment, and there's a lot of pump priming by the, I think it's 95 billion of development expenditure on infrastructures, roads, for that to stimulate the economy going forward.
I see. Shaun, we'd like to go back to our guest in studio, Professor Dr. Geoffrey. Now, what do you think about the budget that was tabled yesterday in terms of addressing the needs of the business sector? Do you agree with what Shaun has said?
Well, I'm wondering who is going to benefit from it. I mean, there was a 45 billion allocation, but this was a mix of grants and loans. And I'm wondering what type of SMEs are interested in these grants and loans. Now, there was another allocation of 1 billion ringgit, which is supposed to be for micro enterprises and to help up to 1 million companies. But that's just 1,000 ringgit each. And I'm wondering to myself, who's going to benefit from 1,000 ringgit?
Yeah.
Actually, if you go to SSM, the Companies Commission, they have 1.2 million SMEs registered as companies and 8.5 million businesses. These are sole proprietorships and so on. So actually, you're looking really at 9.7 million enterprises. And according to the, the type of data that we're looking at, something like 8.7 million of those companies will not benefit from this budget.
I see.
So I'm not really sure that, although it's a big number, I'm not really sure that people will see these benefits.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe perhaps we will see some details to that within the following days and months. Shaun, if we could get back to you, as far as the efficiency of the government goes, with its consistent policies, is this a concern for the MCCI, especially in terms of attracting FDI, foreign direct investment?
Yes. At least they were taking cognizance of some governance by, emphasizing on the Fiscal Accountability Act coming back in. Then there's also the good administration principles and something which the International Chamber has always been talking about, the leakage of the revenues lost through illicit cigarettes and alcohol and the smuggling, where there's an emphasis now and mentioned that there's a lot of tightening of the borders, the multi-agency task force is something which is positive. But then, like Professor Geoffrey said, yesterday's budget, the devil is in the details. And just because it's again, it's the largest, but then does size really count? It's about the execution. And I guess where Professor Williams is alluding to is how is it going to be distributed downwards, and whether any of these SMEs are actually gaining these incentives. I guess maybe someone from the SME would be able to tell whether they actually did benefit from last year's budget, in fact.
Indeed. Well, we actually have someone from the SME joining us after this. Shaun, thank you so much. Professor Geoffrey, it's time for us to take a quick break now. When we return, we'll hear from the National Recovery Council member, Datuk Kang. Will be joining us virtually. This and more coming right up, so don't go away.
Personally, I believe it's a very good move by the government because, one, the graduates, they don't have to wait for a long time to get a job. And secondly, there were so many retrenchment that happened during the COVID MCOs and whatnot, the pandemic era. So I believe it is an opportunity for them to get back into the market or into the job.
Wow, 50,000. Yes, it's a good move from any government providing the jobs, especially in the post-pandemic and this current situation. Yet, ladies and gentlemen, the job is good, but the minimum wage is the thing that we need to address.
I think definitely it's a good move, considering the situation we have now post-COVID. I think the opportunity and jobs is something that people are looking forward, especially for the younger generations.
That's good, because now if you see, because we are doing training and academy, youth trends, they want entrepreneurship, okay? Gig is a trend.
I think entrepreneurship is something that I think the youth should be looking forward, especially in time right now. Entrepreneurship also, I think there is a great opportunities in entrepreneurships instead of employment. So I think that would, I mean, a good benefit for the youngster and for the people especially.
The government gave loan for them for start their business. Is the youngsters will more they're more try hard to achieve their target on the business.
Back with us on Money Matters. Before the break, we were joined by Shaun Edward Cheah from MICCI. We're still with Professor Williams in the studio, but right now we want to hear from the SME sector's view on the budget. So joining us now, National Recovery Council member, Datuk Kang. Hello, Datuk Michael.
Hi, yeah, fine.
All right, so...
Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. It's actually our pleasure to get you to give us like one of the first viewpoints on the budget that we heard yesterday. I have to start with the popular question, the budget that was tabled, the largest allocation. Do you think that this was an attractive budget, especially in terms of addressing the needs of SMEs in particular?
I think this budget, when the first you listen it, you announced by the Minister of Finance, the budget, we can see that there is a recovery budget as well as the election budget. The overall, I think the government did cover quite a fair bit of the areas, if you want, as a minute, when we are talking about the recovery. So I think this year is a year that SME just started. I think next year will be the fully recover. So we need a lot of support from the government. From the budget, we can see that the government has reduced the tax and all others budget. The total amounts for the grant and the soft loan to the SME is about 45 billion.
I see, I see. Now, can you share with us how things are currently for the SME sector? I know that post-pandemic, things have been going on the up and up, but are SMEs still struggling? What is the situation like right now?
I think currently SME are still very struggling because of a lot of SME are facing the last 2 years and almost 3 years. They have zero income. So some of them are just recovery. Some of them are still struggling without shortage of fund, as we know that a lot of SME are facing the incomes not enough for income. Again, the loan from the bank also they are facing quite tough, and collections as well. So when it comes to the recovery this year, when the business started, a lot of SME also facing of the shortage of manpower. And from all this point, you can see that this year SME are really struggling to try to recover. That the SME need a lot of assistance from the government.
I see. Now, Dr. Michael, we'd like to hear from Professor Williams. How do you think the government can further help SMEs?
I'm not sure the government can do very much, because as Datuk Michael has just mentioned, there is a 45 billion allocation here, but it is a mix of grants and loans. And the SMEs have had a lot of grants and loans during the lockdowns, and many of them are really not too keen to take on additional loans because their businesses are not recovering, their collections are not coming in, their revenues are not there. They already have outstanding loans which they're struggling in many instances to pay.
Datuk Michael, do you agree with what Professor Williams said? More loans or more assistance for consumers so that the consumers can contribute to the SMEs? What do you think?
Yeah, I think what Professor says is very true. SME, you ask SME to take the loan for the digitization or automation. I think they are struggling. They are shortage of funds. They don't have enough own capital for daily business. There are no point. They can't able to take additional loan and pay the loan for digitization or this. What the professor say is true, that the SME are looking for more businesses, which is government can able to create more business for the SME, and they have more income. From there, they can recover their business.
I see. Thank you, Datuk Michael. Now, Professor Williams, moving forward, can this budget actually help our nation to recover financially, to weather potential crisis moving forward?
It will put money into the economy. So if we are, as is expected, that we're going to face some headwinds, particularly from the global economy, which is very, very uncertain what's happening in the global economy. It's difficult to say whether we will definitely have a significant downturn or just a slowdown. It's very difficult. Every day things are changing. But what we do know is it's very uncertain in terms of the global economy. But what this will do with this 40 billion put into the economy will help in terms of sustaining domestic demand. But my concern is it won't deliver the structural reform. It won't deliver the supply side reform. It won't help the SMEs that we've just, for exactly the reasons. Many of them have already had the digitalization grant. They've already had the training grants. They've already done it. And so it won't necessarily improve the vibrancy or the competitiveness of the local economy or the agility of the local economy. And that requires structural reform. And one thing that we didn't see, which we were promised actually in the pre-budget statement, was that there would be an emphasis on structural reform. And I didn't see any structural reforms at all. And I think that's a concern, because when you think about what's going to happen in 2023 and beyond, you don't see the change in economic mindset, you don't see the change in economic policy. Indeed. And that means what effect is that going to have on long-term economic growth? The answer is it isn't going to have any effect.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Williams. We deeply appreciate your views. Thank you as well for our guests who have joined us virtually. Once again, Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams, and also our virtual guest, Malaysian International Chamber of Commerce and Industry Executive Director Shaun Edward Cheah, National Recovery Council member Datuk Kang. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be taking a break from next week on, and we will return with our new season in January. From the Money Matters team, a big thank you to you as well for joining us for the whole of 2022. Till we meet again in 2023 for more money insights that matter, I'm Azaria Tagaya. Have a great weekend.